It's a winter night in Angarsk, 1994. A young woman is walking home along an empty street. The temperature is well below freezing. A car slows beside her. A police car. The window rolls down. A man in uniform leans out, smiling, and offers her a ride. She gets in. Of course she gets in. He's a policeman. This is the story of Mikhail Popkov. For 18 years, he was one of the most prolific serial killers in Russian history, and for most of that time, he carried a badge. He would end up confessing to more murders than almost any killer in the country's history, the exact number still climbing, even now, decades later, as investigators keep finding more. But the number of victims was never really the hardest part of this case to understand. The hardest part was this. For years, the people looking for the Angarsk maniac were, in some cases, working 2 desks away from him. What happens when the hunter and the predator wear the same uniform? What happens when a system is built to trust its own, so completely that it stops looking at them at all? Mikhail Popkov was born on March 7, 1964 in Norilsk, a Soviet industrial city so far north that the sun doesn't rise for weeks at a time in winter. His family later moved south to Angarsk, an industrial town in the Irkutsk region of Siberia, built around chemical plants and oil refineries. By the standards of the people who knew him, there was nothing remarkable about his youth. No documented violence, no obvious warning signs. He was, by most accounts, an ordinary young man in an ordinary Soviet industrial town. In the mid-1990s, he joined the police. He rose to the rank of junior lieutenant. He worked patrol duty, the kind of job that puts a man on the streets at night, in a marked car with a badge that opens car doors and apartment doors alike. He married a woman named Elena. She worked in the same department, at the passport desk. They had a daughter, Ekaterina. Colleagues remembered him as friendly, approachable, the kind of officer people liked working with. That likability was not incidental. It was the mechanism. Angarsk itself shaped what was possible. Smoke from the chemical plants hung over the city for days at a time. Winters lasted half the year. Thousands of workers finished night shifts under the orange glow of refinery lights, walking home through streets that were empty by 9, dark by 4 in the afternoon. It was, in the 1990s, a specific kind of place. The city was ringed by prisons, a juvenile detention colony, a pretrial detention center, several penal facilities. Former inmates released back into the same small city made up a visible part of the population. When women began turning up dead, along roadsides in wooded areas outside the city, dumped near the highway connecting Angarsk to Irkutsk, investigators had, in a strange sense, too many suspects, not too few. A city full of ex-convicts, a city where a body in the woods didn't automatically suggest a policeman. It suggested anyone else first. Popkov's first confirmed murder is generally placed in 1992, though some investigators later dated the true beginning of his killings to 1994. The discrepancy itself a small symptom of how disorganized the early investigation was. The pattern, once it later became visible, was almost elegant in its simplicity. He approached women alone at night, near bus stops, outside cafes and clubs, on empty streets. He offered them a ride home. Some accepted because he was charming. Many accepted because he was a policeman. He drove them out of the city to the wooded areas along the highway. He raped them. He killed them, usually with a knife or a bladed weapon. He left the bodies where they would eventually be found, sometimes not for weeks. He did not always use his patrol car. Investigators later established that he preferred his own vehicle when possible. A small precaution, one of the very few he seemed to take. Many of his victims had simply finished a late shift. They were cold, tired, walking home along a road with no streetlights. A car slowing down beside them didn't feel like a threat. It felt like the safest thing on the street. He didn't need many precautions. He had a badge. He had a uniform in the closet. He had, more than anything, the assumption, universal and almost never wrong,
in a system built on hierarchy and trust, that a policeman was the last person anyone should be afraid of.
For years, no one connected the murders to each other, let alone to him. This wasn't only about Popkov's caution. It was about the shape of the system trying to catch him. There was no coordinated serial crime unit in the region equipped to link killings across separate jurisdictions and separate years. Cases were opened locally, investigated locally, and, when they went cold, which was often, set aside locally. A small task force did eventually form to investigate what detectives started calling, informally, the Maniac case. But it operated for years with minimal resources, limited institutional support, and, investigators who worked the case later said, active indifference from some of their own superiors. It is a strange thing to say about a police force, that catching this particular killer was never really made a priority. But for a long time, it wasn't. For as long as he wore the uniform, Popkov was, technically, part of the very institution investigating these unsolved deaths in his own district. Not as a detective assigned to the case, but as a patrol officer whose department was, on paper, responsible for exactly the kind of crime he was committing. No one ever thought to look at him. Why would they? Looking at your own colleagues wasn't how the system was built to work. In 1998, Popkov filed a resignation report and left the police. Colleagues found it puzzling. He gave no clear explanation. He was a capable officer, well-liked, with nothing on record suggesting he wanted to leave. No one connected his departure to anything. Why would they? He went to work reselling used cars. Later, a private security firm. At one point, he dug graves for a living, the darkly literal detail that would only become disturbing in hindsight. He did not stop killing when he left the force. The murders continued through the 2000s. Some years brought several victims, some brought none. Whatever compulsion drove him did not need a badge to keep functioning. It had simply used the badge for a while, because the badge made things easier. Throughout this period, Popkov's home life continued exactly as it had before. He and Elena had been married for decades. She would later tell investigators she never suspected anything, that in nearly 30 years together, she never once doubted her husband. The one detail that unsettled her, she said, looking back, was that he warned her never to trust taxi drivers and that he insisted on personally driving their daughter to and from friends' houses, always. He knew, better than almost anyone, exactly who not to trust. He simply never included himself in that warning. In 2003, investigators obtained a molecular genetic analysis of biological material recovered from several of the victims' remains. It was a DNA profile. It sat in the case file for nearly a decade. Technically part of the evidence, but with no comprehensive database of the region's male population to compare it against, and for years no coordinated push to build one. The technology to catch him had existed, in some form, since 2003. It would take 9 more years and a great many more victims before anyone used it properly. The task force that had been chasing this case for over a decade did not give up. Despite the resistance, despite the years without results, a core group of investigators kept working it, quietly convinced that the killings were connected, long before anyone senior was willing to formally agree. By the early 2000s, that persistence finally produced a plan, a mass DNA collection campaign across the men of the Angarsk area. It started large, nearly 600 names, every man who fit some version of the profile investigators had built over the years. The right age range, access to a vehicle, some plausible connection to the areas where bodies had been found. 600 conversations, 600 saliva samples, 600 men who had no idea why they were really being asked. Investigators worked through the list slowly, methodically, crossing names off one at a time, narrowing it down by occupation, by record, by opportunity, until it had shrunk to a smaller, harder core of possibilities. It was slow work, the kind of work that produces nothing for months and then, without warning, produces everything. Among the names on that list, included on paper almost as a formality because of his past employment and his residence in the district, was a retired junior lieutenant named Mikhail Popkov. He wasn't flagged as a priority. He was just one more name to clear. He was called in as a witness in March 2012. He gave his sample without apparent hesitation, calm, cooperative, the same easy manner colleagues remembered from his years on the force. Investigators had no particular reason yet to think he was any different from the 599 other men on the list. The results came back in June. A match. By the time anyone could act on it, Popkov was already gone. According to investigators who reconstructed his movements afterward, he had gone straight from the police station to a lawyer. The next day, he left the city with his family, telling people it was a vacation. First to his mother's home in central Russia, then further still to Vladivostok, on the opposite side of the country, more than 4,000 kilometers away. The murders, notably, had already stopped in 2010, 2 years before the DNA campaign even began. Popkov would later claim he had sensed even then that the investigation was closing in and had simply stopped. Whether that was true or something closer to instinct catching up with fact after his arrest, investigators were never entirely sure. He was arrested in Vladivostok that June, 18 years almost to the day after his first confirmed murder. He was found, officially, in the middle of buying a car. He was also found in possession of a weapon he was, investigators said, prepared to use against the officers who came for him. He did not use it. 18 years of investigation ended not with a chase, but with a quiet arrest in a parking lot, 4,000 kilometers from where it had all started. He was brought back to Irkutsk. The confession, once it began, did not stop for years. He was formally charged at first with 22 murders. In January 2015, an Irkutsk court found him guilty on all counts and sentenced him to life in prison. That should have been the end of the story. It wasn't close. Starting in 2017, in the years following his first conviction, Popkov began confessing to dozens more killings. Murders investigators hadn't previously connected to him at all. 59 additional confessions, then more, spread across a period investigators would spend years verifying, one case at a time. In 2018, a second trial confirmed 60 further murders. He received a second life sentence, the first time in the history of Russian judicial practice that a single defendant had been handed 2 separate life terms. The number kept climbing after that. By the early 2020s, investigators had confirmed more than 80 killings. By 2023, they'd closed several additional cases dating back to the mid-1990s. By late 2025, the official count stood at 91 confirmed victims, with 3 additional attempted murders on record, and that December, a further Angarsk court conviction for 2 more killings from 2008, adding another 10 years on top of 2 life sentences that had already made the number, in practical terms, meaningless. Investigators who worked the case say they still aren't certain it's finished. Popkov spent years driving cars from Vladivostok back across the country for resale. Long routes, long stretches of highway, long stretches of time no one has ever been able to fully account for. When asked, eventually, to explain any of it, Popkov offered almost nothing resembling remorse. Psychiatric evaluation during the investigation produced an unusual diagnosis, what examiners described as an overwhelming compulsive drive toward killing. Not, under Russian law, a condition that qualifies as legal insanity. He was found fit to stand trial, fit to be held responsible. On every occasion the question was asked. In one interview, reflecting on the technology that eventually caught him, he said something that investigators would later quote often, not because it explained anything, but because of what it revealed about how he understood himself. I couldn't have predicted DNA testing. I was born in the wrong century. Not an apology, a complaint about timing. The Angarsk case is, in the end, not really a story about how one man managed to hide for 18 years. Plenty of killers hide for less, with far less protecting them. It's a story about what a uniform does to suspicion, about a system that spent years looking everywhere except at its own. Not necessarily out of malice, but because the entire architecture of trust that police work depends on runs one direction. Citizens are taught to suspect strangers and to trust the badge. For nearly 2 decades, women got into that car because they believed the uniform meant safety. They were right. The uniform was built to mean exactly that. It just happened to belong to the wrong man. This has been Red Files. If this story stayed with you, subscribe, because there are more files to open. New case next week. The Popkov case is documented in Russian court records from the 2015 and 2018 trials, investigative journalism from Meduza and other Russian outlets covering the Maniac Group Task Force, and subsequent court proceedings through 2025 and 2026 confirming additional victims. The full number of confirmed murders has continued to grow as investigators verify further confessions, and may not be final even now. Red Files does not glorify violence. These stories are told to remember the victims and to understand how such crimes were allowed to happen.